Hello, and welcome to myfinanceteacher.org. In this video, as usual, we're going to look at precious metals, mostly gold. We're going to look at cryptocurrencies, mostly Bitcoin, and we're going to look at the general stock market, mostly S&P 500. Before we start, let me remind you that if you want more detailed analysis, consider joining us at myfinanceteacher.org. First, let's jump into gold. Over the last couple of weeks, I think gold has started a new short-term daily cycle, which at the moment is not really performing that well. Given that the intermediate cycle is already relatively old, it's at 157 days old, I expect the rest of the ongoing short-term daily cycle to be in a general decline into the end of the ongoing intermediate cycle. If you look at history of gold prices, these intermediate cycles usually last for about a half a year. So I think we still have 1 or 2 months in front of us until that significant low in gold price, which will be, I think, a very nice buying opportunity. How significant of a low is it going to be? It's hard to say at the moment, but I think a round number of around $1,800 per ounce over the next several weeks might turn out to be a cycle low. Although even a lower price is quite possible. For example, if gold retests these spring highs, that would be a price of somewhere around $1,760. So generally I expect declining prices. How far the decline is going to take us, we'll have to see. Next, let's have a look at the 4-hour chart in gold. The reason I want to have a look at it is I see some pattern here which kind of looks like a head and shoulders pattern with a couple of candles of some anomaly over here in the right shoulder. If this head and shoulders pattern plays out as head and shoulders patterns usually do, that would give you a measured target on the downside based on the height of this pattern. At the lower level, let's say we have a price of around $1,870. At the higher level, let's say we have a price of around $2,000. That's a $130 drop, and that gives us a measured target of around $740 per ounce if this pattern completes as a head and shoulders and plays out as head and shoulders usually do. That actually is close enough to that retest of spring highs, somewhere at about 1760. Next, let's have a look at this Optimism index in gold. These red marks over here show us the level of that Optimism index in some of the previous intermediate cycle lows. Although current Optimism is already pretty close to the level of this Optimism at the previous intermediate cycle, we are still far from any kind of fear that is closer to this green line. If you look further back into history, gold cycles tend to give us a cycle low when this Optimism index is pretty low. So in general, I think patience is still advised in precious metals. Next, let's have a look at Bitcoin. The Bitcoin cycles usually last for about a couple of months. The ongoing cycle in Bitcoin is 59 days old. And looks like over the last week or so, Bitcoin has been relatively weak. So over the next 1 or 2 weeks, I actually expect the end of this cycle and maybe a nice buying opportunity. If you want to take advantage of this buying opportunity, together with the members at myfinanceteacher.org, consider joining us. As I mentioned in the previous video, we saw this negative divergence on RSI, which often precedes some weakness in prices. And I think further weakness is quite likely. After all, Bitcoin hasn't even poked through the lower range of the Bollinger Bands yet. If you look at history, although it's not every time that the Bitcoin cycle low pokes through the lower range of the Bollinger Bands, for example, it didn't happen over here in early May, it often does happen. So I'm still waiting for a nicer buying opportunity in Bitcoin. Next, let's have a look at the 4-hour chart in Bitcoin. And since late July, Bitcoin has been in this uptrend channel, and whichever way you connect the lows within this channel since late July, whether you connect it as it's shown with this dark blue line or as it's shown with this lighter blue line, in either case, it looks like Bitcoin wants to finally break below this trend line and give us the end of the ongoing cycle. Another thing you might notice here is that this trend of higher highs that we've seen all through August is possibly now broken with a lower low near the end of August. And lastly, looking at the Optimism index in Bitcoin, again, these red marks indicate previous Bitcoin cycle lows. As you see, usually cycle lows take place when this Optimism index is pretty close to this green line. At the moment, the optimism is still a little bit high. It's at 49. So again, some patience I think is advised, although waiting is not going to be very long. And lastly, let's have a look at the general stock market. This is S&P 500 in front of you. The intermediate cycle has been going on for 154 days. These usually last for just over half a year. So as election looms in the US, I would expect some weakness over the next several months. Before we continue, let me remind you guys to subscribe to the channel if you haven't, and click that bell notification. Thanks a lot. The short-term daily cycle has been going on for 56 days. These usually last for about a couple of months, so I would expect some weakness over the next 1 or 2 weeks. And as you see, the 14-day RSI has just entered into overbought area. So I don't think it's time to consider buying right now when the markets are getting into overbought. Next, looking at the S&P Futures, before the markets open, we see that futures are actually a little bit higher compared to the closing price on Monday. The S&P 500 closed at 34.31 on Monday, and the futures are at 34.39. Looking at the economic calendar for this week, you will notice that on Thursday there will be Jackson Hole Symposium, which is a relatively important event. Fed Chairman Powell is going to give a speech on Thursday within that symposium. And if the Fed is relatively dovish this Thursday, that might still actually push the markets a little bit higher, but since the ongoing short-term daily cycle and the intermediate cycle are relatively old already, any kind of dovishness from the Fed on Thursday during that Jackson Hole Symposium might actually play out as buy the rumor, sell the fact scenario. And lastly, a quick look at S&P 500 Optimism Index. Again, red marks indicate previous intermediate cycle lows on S&P 500, and as you see, usually the cycle lows take place when this optimism is relatively low, when nobody wants to buy this asset. Whereas at the moment, the optimism index is beyond the red line. So again, you probably don't want to chase the markets right now. So that is my opinion on gold, Bitcoin, and general stock market. Let me know what you think. Join us at myfinancesteacher.org if you want more regular and more detailed updates. And in addition to these regular updates, my colleague writes these weekly newsletters where he shares his investment experience that he's accumulated over a number of decades. For now, I wish you a productive and a pleasant day. Good luck in your trades.